Hello guys, welcome back. This is the continuation series of advanced React components. In this session, we will discuss about component lifecycle. Basically, React application components are rendered onto the virtual DOM, and on the virtual DOM, component goes through some methods. These methods are specialized event handlers that are called at various points during the component life. We can even add our own code to these methods to perform various activities. These methods are also known as component lifecycle methods, also component lifecycle hooks. These lifecycles are divided into three different categories. Mounting methods, which is an initialization phase. Updating methods, which is an updating phase. After that, there is also a prop change method if there is any props and states created into the component. And the last is unmounting methods, which is in distraction phase. Each of these phases contains some lifecycle methods which are specific only to them. Let's say if I talk about mounting methods or initialization phase, we have get default props. In this get default props, the method is used to specify the default value of the props available in the component. And the second is get initial state. This method is used to specify the default values of state. The third is component will mount. This is the last method that we can call before your component gets rendered into the DOM. But if you call the set state inside this method, you will not re-render it. Next is we have a render method. This method's responsibility is to return the single root HTML as we discussed the JSX. It returns that JSX. We can also return null or false in case you don't want to render anything. Next is component did mount. Once the component is rendered and placed on the DOM, this method is called to perform any DML or DOM query operations. The second phase is updating phase or updating methods. Whatever hook methods we write in this, once the component is added to the DOM, they can update and re-render only when a state change occurs. Each time the state changes, the component calls its render again. Should component update method allows us to control your component's behavior of updating itself. If you return a true from this method, the component will update. Else if this method returns a false, the component will skip the updating. Before this, we also have component will update, and that method is called just before your component is about to update. The third is render method. If you are returning false via should component update, the code inside this render will be invoked again to ensure that your component displays itself properly after the changes. Last is the component did update in this updating lifecycle hook methods. Once the component is updated and rendered successfully, then this method is invoked. We can put any code inside this method which you would like to execute once the component is updated. As I discussed, if any change has occurred in the props, then component will receive props, executes when any prop changes happen. Once this component will receive props, will execute. After that, all these updating methods will also execute simultaneously. Afterwards, there is an unmounting phase. This is the last phase of the component lifecycle in which the component is destroyed and removed from the DOM completely. It contains only one method, that is component will mount. Once this method is invoked, your component is removed from the DOM permanently. And this is the method when we perform any cleanups related task like removing the event listeners, stopping the timers, destroying the connections, and so on. This is the entire component lifecycle diagram As I discussed that the life cycle starts from the initialization phase where the get default props executes to initialize the default value to this dot props. Then get initial state gets execute to specify the default value to the state. Then component will mount executes to ensure that we can call before our component gets rendered into the DOM to make any set state changes. Then the render method will execute to ensure the responsibilities of returning the JSX. Then component did mount will execute once the component gets rendered and placed over a DOM, and after that the updating phase gets started. When you make any change to the props, you set the props, then again the updating phase gets started. Component will receive props gets execute, then component did update will execute. Component did update will return true or false. Accordingly, the render method will return the JSX or not, and component did mount will ensure that if the component is updated and rendered successfully, it will ensure to put any code inside this method that you want to execute once the component is updated. And after that, at the last, the component unmount will take the place. Component will unmount, execute, and clean up all the related tasks that we would like to destroy after this entire component life cycle to be executed successfully. Let's practically understand how the flows goes on, at what time which life cycle hook method gets executed. So this is our React component life cycle demonstration. As of now, I am having app.js which returns component lifecycle message initially. Afterwards, to take it forward, inside this component, first I am going to create a constructor that will receive the props. I am supposed to print a message console.log constructor call. Afterwards, we have component will mount, where I am simply printing console.log component will mount call. Afterwards, we have component did mount, again to print the message component did mount call. If we see back, these are component will mount and component did mount are the mounting methods phase. After that, if in between of that, before component will mount and component already mount, whatever you write in the render method gets executed. So for a sake of clarification, inside the render method, I am printing console.log render call. So when I am supposed to run this application, this is actually printing constructor call, and these three are the hook methods that comes under initialization phase. First is component will mount, then render called, and then component did mount. This happens at the very initial stage of the life cycle. Next time onwards, when any props gets changed and state gets changed, only the updating methods or updating phase will be executed. So the next phase methods are component will receive props. I'm simply printing a message console.log component will receive props call. Once the component will receive the prop changes, should component update will called up. As of now, I am printing only console statement, but later it returns true and false. If it returns true, then render method will again execute, otherwise it will be skipped. So this is component should update. And once the render method gets executed or not, component did update will verify whether the changes happens or not. So here I am printing console.log. Component will receive, and before this component did update, it will also get whether it will receive updates or not. So component will update gets executed. Later we have component did update, and we already have returned the render method. That's a part of this update phase also. So once I'll run this, I'll see only initialization phase happens. Now the question is when the update will take place. Update mounting state will take place when any change gets happened. For that particular changes, I'm supposed to create a state in my constructor, this dot state, where we have the property with count equals to 0. Then we have this dot sum method. This is an event or a method. This dot sum. This dot sum dot bind to this current component. Then we also have this dot decrease event that I am supposed to bind with this current component, right? Afterwards, when the sum method will be invoked, this dot state change set state, the component state will be changed here. The count, whichever count is the current status value is there, it will be incremented by 1. And similarly, in the decrease event, it will be decreased by 1, right? Afterwards, in the render method or a hook method, I'm supposed to print the state value, which is this dot state dot count. Afterwards, I'm supposed to get 2 buttons. The first button is for sum. When I'll click over this button, it is actually supposed to call this dot sum. And when I'm supposed to click over a second button, it is going to call the method decrease. Let's make a break ruler. So I can see that initially the initial phase gets executed. Next time onwards, whenever I am supposed to click over a sum, should component update gets executed. But here I can see that the rest of the update phases events are not executing. Only should component update gets called whenever I click over any event. Because as I discussed that until and unless this should component update will not return true, then the particular will update event will not execute to verify that render will execute again or will change the state or not. So when I click over a sum, I can see that should component update executed, it returns true. Will update will verify that all gets perfect. Render will re-render the entire component JSX with the virtual DOM. As I discussed earlier, the entire DOM will not be updated, only changes will be affected. And component did update will verify that yes, the changes happens. So when I click over sum, I can see that again only the update phase gets executed, but the initial phase is not executing again and again. That's how works these component life cycle. And at the end, you can simply write component will unmount, where we can actually write the cleanup code that will not be visible because at that time the component will be destroyed. I hope you really understand the component lifecycle hook methods. So in this entire React Advanced Components, we discussed that how React supports composition over deep inheritance, how import the useful and less restricting with extents, how to pass a render function to your component instead of children, then merge new props into the elements using the props.children. That's what we have discussed. Thank you so much, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.